Welcome to the Federal Railroad Administration's Corridor ID webinar and policy updates.
Going back to task 5, environmental planning will be in the core scope of work, but it'll look a little bit different. It will, at this stage, rely on the language in the regs, which say, describe potential environmental benefits. That can happen qualitatively. And you start to gather the presence of sensitive resources in the study area, look at existing data, conducting a desktop survey. It's not field work at this time. Similarly, as to railroads and operators, limited resources, and it's been a challenge for meaningful engagement for them at this early stage. They are more likely to engage once feasibility is determined and service is defined. At this stage, notification and awareness is probably a more realistic goal as a part of your coordination with them. We've been talking about the substance of a core service development plan and the level of analysis being reduced. But I do want to mention that the packaging and the reviews will look a lot differently too. Here you see an example. The environmental planning, the financial and economic planning, and the governance can all be bundled into one submittal for FRA's review. FRA is eager to get to determination quickly, as are the sponsors, and so it will have a different level of scrutiny on the document's review and approval. It will have an order of magnitude less deliverables. Many of this work product can be bundled or deferred, including methodologies. You'll see a lighter touch from FRA navigating through the core service development plan. Governance will look a little bit different. It's going to focus on the capability and the capacity needs for a corridor and for a sponsor to move through the life cycle. It doesn't necessarily need to have definitive outcomes, but there's a recognition that sponsors will need to evolve later phases of project development. Similarly, there's not an expectation to identify an operator or type of operator at this phase. Those operators, it's a lot easier for them to engage once there's a greater definition and once feasibility is determined. Implementation planning is critical for any feasibility study. This one's going to focus on the next steps needed to trigger more rigorous analysis. It's not necessarily to map out to opening day. So at this point, we'll be looking for a list of representative capital projects needed to introduce service. Not necessarily site-specific, we talked about that. And it's with an expectation that more planning will be needed before a corridor can move into step 3. And that means NEPA and PE. So the packaging and the implementation plan will still be required, but it'll look a little bit different. I'll hand it over to Barbara now to talk about how FRA will work with sponsors to incorporate changes into its scope of work.
Thank you, David, for explaining what goes into a core SVP. Now I'm going to talk about what's next for a new corridor that is going to be impacted by this core SVP. It is important to note that there were 34 corridors that could have been impacted by this decision. Not all 34 corridors were impacted. For those that have been selected to complete a core SVP, FRA has had the necessary conversations with them to discuss what it means for their corridor and what next steps to expect from FRA. And I'm going to go over those next steps here. The next immediate step after the conversation with the corridor around their status in the CID program is for FRA to take on the lion's share of the work to update any previously submitted statement of work, schedule, and budget to reflect the new core SVP requirements. And I'm very happy to announce that right now, as I speak, myself and the project teams are actively working on updating those scopes. Come January, impacted corridors should have the new scope language reflected on any previously submitted deliverables, which is very exciting. Once those scopes are back with the sponsors, FRA will continue to have any additional conversations that are necessary to help make sure the sponsors fully understand what's expected of them and complete any additional tweaks that the sponsor may want to make to their core SDP scope. The other important thing to note on what's next for a corridor is that for ones that are doing a core SDP, that they will be entering step 2 of the Corridor ID program. So if you're doing a core SDP, that will be the appropriate level of planning that is reflective of your corridor's past planning work. Or if you're doing a comprehensive, that will be reflective of your corridor's past planning work. Either way, you will enter step 2 of the Corridor ID program to complete an SDP, as long as you have the 10% non-federal match required for entry per the NOFO. Let's flash forward a couple years and talk about what happens once these corridors complete their core SDP. The important thing to note is that what we'll be reviewing in a couple years' time is the same as how we reassess the corridors this year. As Lau mentioned earlier, we were looking to see if new corridors had completed the 3 core planning elements prior to selection into the Corridor ID program. Those 3 items were the feasibility study, market analysis, and initial timetables. And we not only checked to see that they were completed, but we also checked to make sure that they met the necessary standards that we were looking for internally at FRA. This is also something that Lau went over in his portion of the presentation. Once corridors complete their core SDP, we're going to be implementing the same review process. We're going to make sure that the 3 items here on the screen are properly completed according to the criteria that we showed earlier on in the slide deck. If the answer is yes, that these 3 items were sufficiently completed, then the sponsor of those corridors may conduct more robust planning tasks by either amending their Step 2 grant or obtaining a new Step 2 grant. That means that corridors undertaking the core SDP would then be able to graduate into a more comprehensive service development plan and complete more robust, detailed service planning. If you're wondering why we say amend or obtain a new Step 2 grant, it's really a matter of timing. We're trying to move pretty quickly through this process, so we're going to choose the appropriate path to ensure that we can continue to advance relatively speedily to advance the corridor's work. If a sponsor has not sufficiently completed these 3 core planning elements at the end of their core SDP process, then those sponsors will not be able to advance their corridor to subsequent stages in the CID program without further independent work at cost to the sponsor. That doesn't necessarily mean you're out of the program, but further work would need to be completed in order to better assess the status of your corridor in the program, and that work would have to be done at cost to the sponsor, not FRA. And this concludes the updates to the CID program that are focused on new corridors. Now we're going to switch over to learning more about how we've updated the Corridor ID program to better meet existing corridors where they are. As I mentioned earlier, we selected about 28 corridors in the CID program that already have rail service. Since these corridors already had service prior to entry into the Corridor ID program, that likely means that many of them already have capital projects in different stages of development. In order to better meet these existing corridors where they are, FRA developed a mechanism for existing corridors to advance these projects into future life cycles, independent of the corridor-wide SDP process. The corridor-wide SDP being more of the comprehensive SDP that I was referring to earlier. This approach to advance capital projects into future project life cycles is called a near-term SDP. The near-term SDP allows corridor sponsors to submit to FRA capital projects that have completed the required planning activities associated with Step 2 to satisfy the statutory requirements of an SDP. These capital projects are ready to advance into subsequent stages of the project life cycle prior to completion of an SDP for the full corridor. The near-term SDP would be a summary of all of the previous planning work that was completed outside of the Corridor ID program that proves that the capital projects are at the appropriate project lifecycle stage to which they want to advance. FRA can advance projects into Step 3 if they meet the CID Step 3 readiness criteria and have previous planning work that meet the CID SDP statute requirements. Additionally, and this is a new update to the process, FRA can use the near-term SDP to also advance projects and place them onto the CID project pipeline. Those projects would have needed to complete the work associated with Step 2 and 3, which would also include meeting project development milestones. It is important to restate that the near-term SDP is done in addition to the comprehensive SDP. Since we previously announced that the near-term SDP would occur at last year's AASHTO court, some corridors have already started initiating the near-term SDP process with FRA. What you see here on the screen is a more formalized, structured approach that is going to be applied to all corridors who choose to undertake this process. So if you're interested, you would need to, in Step 1, consult with FRA and confirm the near-term SDP process and discuss qualifying projects. If sponsors are interested in taking this approach and have the necessary projects, the sponsor would then do a formal written request. It doesn't necessarily have to be a memo, but it more often than not takes on that form. For some corridors, depending on the number of projects they have, an Excel spreadsheet might be the best way to document the projects that they are looking to advance into future project life cycles. And regardless of the form the written request takes, the most important thing to note is that this written request will document and explain why the sponsor thinks that those projects are qualified to advance to future project lifecycle stages. The sponsor is responsible for confirming that the necessary previous planning work has already been completed, that the projects have the necessary stakeholder support to advance as well. FRA will then review the request and coordinate with the sponsor on any changes to the projects that need to be made. FRA will then provide what we've been calling 90% approval, where we're going to say, yes, these projects are generally good to advance for final approval in step 2. The sponsor can then go ahead and include subtask 1.3 in their statement of work for their step 2 grant. It is important to note that a core SCP and a near-term SCP cannot coexist. I know we're presenting on both of them in this presentation, but in order to do a near-term SCP, you must be an existing corridor. And if you're an existing corridor, you're completing a comprehensive SCP, a more robust planning effort, not a core SCP. Right, now for the million-dollar question that I get on a pretty regular basis. What projects qualify for the near-term SCP? If you're looking to advance a project on an existing corridor that is doing an extension, then projects on the near-term SCP cannot be on the portion of the corridor that is going to be new. The project must be on the portion of the corridor that already have existing rail service. Regarding the types of projects we are considering advancing via near-term SCP, we are interested in projects such as new sidings and station and signal improvements and other small, straightforward initiatives that can be efficiently implemented and will positively impact the overall operations along the corridor. Please note that this is not an exhaustive list, but rather a general framework guiding our review of project submissions. And now for the $500,000 question that I get. What happens to the projects that don't qualify for a near-term SCP? FRA will review and approve all of the projects that go into a near-term SCP. If those projects do not initially qualify, it's really not a big deal. Projects can still be developed as part of the comprehensive SCP under Step 2. The other important thing I want to note is that there is a small chance that when you actually complete the near-term SCP in Step 2 and summarize all of your previous work on these projects, that a portion of the work ends up not meeting the qualifications and therefore would no longer qualify for advancement via a near-term SCP. Again, not a big deal. You would still complete the near-term SCP according to your grant agreement. The only difference being that any project that doesn't advance into a future project lifecycle would continue to develop in Step 2 under the comprehensive SCP instead of advancing into Step 3 or the project pipeline via the near-term SCP. Let's talk about how you would actually advance these capital projects into Step 3 once you're done with your near-term SCP. FRA will consider a project ready for Step 3 if you have a fully approved near-term SCP and you meet the program readiness criteria, which you see here on the right side of the screen. Let's quickly go over the program readiness criteria. As I mentioned earlier, you do need to have stakeholder support for these projects. We want to make sure that the host railroad, among others, are on board with advancing your projects. So it is important that you obtain letters of support from the necessary stakeholders in order to advance these projects. Next, you want to make sure you have the correct governance structure. Considering near-term SCPs only apply to existing corridors, this is a pretty easy box to check. Next, we want to make sure that the funding has already been identified. Again, repeating myself, we are looking for these projects to advance pretty quickly. So we are looking to see that you already have the 20% non-federal match for Step 3, and that you either already have or have promises of funding for final design and construction, which is what comes after Step 3. And then last but not least, we want to make sure that the projects that advance through the near-term SCP have a standalone benefit, so they are not going to negatively impact the development of the comprehensive service development plan for the entire corridor. And if these conditions are met, then your projects will advance into Step 3, and we will begin developing the Step 3 grant agreement. Let's discuss how you advance projects into the project pipeline. We consider a project ready for the project pipeline if you have an FRA-approved near-term SCP, meet the program readiness criteria that I went through on the previous slide, and have completed the project development milestones listed here on the right that are included in the FRA Railroad Capital Guidance document as well. A lot of this is pretty straightforward. So in order to make sure that your project is ready for the pipeline, which means it's ready for final design and construction, we want to make sure that you have the correct level of NEPA decision, the appropriate level of design, and that you already know how much these projects are going to cost, and that you have a sense of how long they're going to take to implement. Additionally, as I mentioned, again, for the program readiness criteria, that you have a plan for how you're going to finance these projects. If the projects meet these requirements, then FRA will be able to place your projects directly onto the project pipeline. And that concludes our two major updates on the CID program. Now I'm going to discuss some immediate next steps for the program. Thank you to all who submitted questions in advance. I'm going to go ahead and answer one of them right now. And that question is, when is the Step 2 directed no-fill going to post? So as I mentioned on one of my earlier slides, each CID steps requires a new grant agreement. In order to obtain a grant agreement, we have to post a directed no-fill in order to provide the sponsors who are ready to advance to Step 2 with the appropriate grant funds to begin their Step 2 work. It is an administrative task that needs to be completed and is not competitive. Right now, we are targeting January 2026 to post the directed no-fill. Please be aware that there will be several Step 2 directed no-fills posted as corridors wrap up their Step 1 work and become ready for Step 2. Additionally, throughout 2026 and 2027, we will be releasing some critical resources to aid sponsors with the development of their service development plan. This will include a demand forecasting guide, the SDP implementation guide, and as Lau described earlier, the parametric model tool. Last but not least, this was another question that we had submitted by a few webinar attendees, and that question is, when is the next CID notice of funding opportunity going to occur? I want to make clear that this question is referring to the competitive no-fill in order to obtain a Step 1 grant and be selected into the CID program. This is very different from the Step 2 directed no-fill. Right now, we are targeting calendar year 2026 for the next CID competitive no-fill. As many of you are aware, we typically post a grant calendar with all of the official dates for our various grant program no-fills. Once that calendar is published, we should be able to share a more specific dates for when the next competitive no-fill for the Corridor ID program will take place. And that concludes our presentation for today. Thank you all so much for joining. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at paxraildev@dot.gov. Thank you again for your interest and support of the Corridor ID program.